We talked a little earlier about the different relationships that the neurotic and the psychotic have to language. The neurotic person accepts language as a constraining and containing apparatus. The neurotic, as a result, is able to inhabit language. The psychotic, though, is somebody who rejects language, the symbolic, rejects language as a constraining and containing force. So they live without constraint, but they also do not get to enjoy containment, structure, feeling at home in the world. They always feel out of sorts. Now, what happens, Lacan says? He says that the neurotic is allowed to inhabit language, but the psychotic, weirdly enough, is inhabited by language, is possessed by language. Language is constantly intruding upon the psychotic. Now, this is a really important thing that's happening here. I told you earlier that it was a major turn in the conversation. It is one. Let's start basic and talk about the explanatory power here. The neurotic accepts the big O other. Now, that's another word that, for our purposes right now, we can just use it as another word for the symbolic. This big O other is like the structure that we know of as society, with all of its laws, languages, expectations, constraints, and the like. That's just fine. It's okay to have that thing. In fact, for most of us, it's the most okay thing because it's what gives our lives meaning and coherence. The psychotic rejects all that, rejects that big O other, and as a result is constantly adrift, constantly unmoored in their world. They don't figure out where they fit in it. Now, what Lacan says is that doesn't mean that their need for structure and containment goes away. He says, in fact, all that does is set the stage for the return of the big other, not as a symbolic enterprise, but as an imaginary one. You can see this on page 209, probably 6, 7, 8 lines down, 7 lines down or something. We get the impression that it's insofar as he hasn't acquired or has lost this big O other that he encounters this purely imaginary other. It's because the symbolic has been rejected that its, I hesitate to say function, but its authority will return in a kind of transmutated form at the level of the imaginary, which for the psychotic means at the level of delusion, at the level of hallucination. The psychotic, for instance, as a paranoid, let's say, is constantly concerned that aliens are trying to read their thoughts. For example, let's just say, these aliens are an imaginary big other, an imaginary authority that nobody else can see, but that the psychotic feels is out to get them. Part of the reason why the psychotic feels that is because more deeply they feel fundamentally adrift in the world. And when they feel like aliens are coming after them, they feel like, okay, my life at least has some direction now. At least now I know something about what's going on around me. They're all out to get me. So the paranoid is somebody who has foreclosed the symbolic, given up, rejected, refused the symbolic order. But their craving for order and coherence hasn't gone away. And so what happens as a result is that their imaginary takes the place here and does the work of creating a huge, larger than life other that can give the psychotic's life meaning. In this case, it's the aliens. I'm the chosen one. The gods are speaking to me. The NSA is listening to all my phone calls. The paranoid is somebody who has given up on normal pathways for life meaning, and as a result has set the stage for a craving and an acceptance and a delusional pursuit of abnormal or deranged or hallucinatory big others, not at the level of the symbolic, but at the level of the imaginary. That's what's happening here on page 209. He hasn't acquired or has lost this big other at the symbolic, as language, as society. Because he does that, he encounters this purely imaginary other. And you can fill in the blank with any sort of conspiratorial agent that you've heard somebody on the street corner in the city working through. This is a hugely important aspect of what's going on here. And I want you to also notice this. The neurotic experiences the symbolic as a source of containment, we've said, but also as a source of constraint. The name of the Father, the know of the Father, is also a prohibition. And the neurotic accepts that. And they get on with their lives. They repress their castration, their acceptance of the know, and they get on with their lives as proper ladies and gentlemen, usually. Using the symbolic, accepting their place in the symbolic, inhabiting language, and so forth. The psychotic rejects all this, we know. They reject the constraining as well as the containing aspects. Now, I've told you that when the psychotic shifts to the imaginary and creates this delusional figure of a larger-than-life authority like aliens trying to read their brain, that it gives their life a sense of meaning. Here's what else I want to say. The sense of containment and meaning that the psychotic experiences in the imaginary, at the level of the hallucination, at the level of the conspiracy, is also matched by the sense of constraint that the psychotic feels relative to that conspiracy, relative to that larger-than-life agent. Now, this is crucial. It's not just that aliens are trying to read his thoughts. It's that the psychotic feels like aliens are making him act a certain way. These are not just larger-than-life extraterrestrial beings that are supplanting the symbolic in order to give the psychotic's life. These are also domineering, controlling, compelling beings. The same way that the symbolic constrains and compels the neurotic person, the imaginary here, at the level of the delusion, at the level of the hallucination, at the level of the imaginary big other, is also compulsive. The psychotic usually feels like they are being made to do something, like they're being denied freedom. The very freedom that their rejection of the symbolic allowed them to maintain is now given up at the level of the imaginary, because it's not just that aliens are reading their thoughts, it's that aliens are making them do stuff. There are forces operating in and through the psychotic that the psychotic feels is beyond their control. So notice what's happening here. What the neurotic gets at the level of the symbolic, constraint and containment, the psychotic gets at the level of the imaginary, constraint and containment. Aliens and conspiracy theories and paranoias give the psychotic's life meaning. But all of these conspiratorial, paranoid agents, these imaginary others, they're also forceful beings. The same authority that the neurotic grants to the symbolic as a way of controlling their lives, of determining their lives, the psychotic grants to the imaginary, to their delusions. The aliens are out to get them. The aliens are trying to read their thoughts, but also to control their minds. So when you see the psychotic person with tinfoil wrapped around their heads, they say, this is to keep the aliens from reading my thoughts. But it's also to keep them from controlling my actions. So it's interesting to note what Lacan is arguing here. What the psychotic experiences at the level of the imaginary, the neurotic experiences at the level of the symbolic. Here again we see an interesting flipping of the situation. The neurotic is somebody who is certain of reality, but uncertain of its relevance to them. The psychotic is somebody who is uncertain of reality, but certain that what they see is of profound relevance to them. And here what we see is also happening on the flip side again. The neurotic is somebody who derives a sense of constraint and containment from the symbolic, And the psychotic is somebody who derives a sense of constraint and containment from the imaginary. It's an interesting turn of events.